First up, Mr. Ryan Schulz. Ryan is the head of our agency. He's done many things throughout his career, including market chocolate.
Yes.
Yes.
Man of many lives.
All right. So we'll get going with Ryan. He's also the tallest guy here. He's the only reason I ever feel short.
Good morning, everyone. A little better than that. Good morning, everyone. Okay. We'll throw a party tonight again because you were so nice to me. I'm Ryan Schulz. I'm the executive director here at One North. I'm so excited to have you guys here at the Parker in Palm Springs for the assembly. The thing I'm most excited about is all the new faces. So there's definitely some friends. Hi, Stacy. Hi, Derek. There's other folks that I know for sure, and I met a bunch of people last night, but there's a bunch of people I haven't met, and that makes me super excited because you guys are going to get to experience this fresh. And it is a pretty special event. I mean, Bill hyped it up, and he's exactly right. This is a different kind of event. We're not going to be talking about features and functionality and stuff that we want to sell to you and do with you. And it is a different kind of thought leadership experience. And so we're going to dig into it. For those of you who weren't here last year, weren't with us last year, I'm going to catch you up a little bit on what happened last year at the assembly, because this year's topic is a direct kind of connection, or at least it's an offshoot of what we talked about last year. And last year's topic was really a conversation. There was lots of back and forth. That last day, we had a great sort of big roundtable conversation in the conference room all about sort of the long view, developing long-term planning with your organization, just for yourself, to be able to take yourself out of the day-to-day, the chaos that we might experience on a day-to-day. There's the connection, the obvious jumping off point, but really about long-term planning so that you can deal with the tsunami of change that we're experiencing on a regular basis. I made the case in my talk last year that we're experiencing more change over the course of the last 40 or 50 years than we've experienced probably in most of human history in a faster time frame. We've created new economies, new ways of doing business. Most of our jobs didn't exist even 60 years ago, 50 years ago. And then our jobs are constantly being transformed and changed in real time. There's one thing up there in the top right-hand corner that was just sort of the beginning of a panic moment idea, but it turned into a fever pitch over the course of the year. And then it sort of abated just recently. I don't know if you guys felt that in the news. It's not as scary because I think we're all starting to realize maybe AI is not out to just get us. Maybe there are some ways that we can work with it. And maybe it's not going to just completely replace all of our workforce right away. But it's still there, and it's going to transform. I just had a great conversation with Jen Lill this morning at 6 o'clock in the morning when I couldn't sleep anymore, over coffee, about how we believe AI is going to change the internet kind of forever, and probably for the better. And that's a really interesting kind of optimistic way to think about the world. But that's a topic for a different conversation, maybe later at the party. In order to sort of get people in that mindset, we wanted to take them to summer camp, essentially. So we found an amazing location in Sundance, Utah, Sundance Mountain Resort. It was a beautiful remote location. We really wanted to yank people out of their everyday experience, have them sort of leave their cell phones and their laptops as much behind as they possibly could, immerse themselves in the natural wonder that is Sundance. We had sessions by a babbling brook. We hiked to a waterfall. We took a gondola ride to the top of a mountain that barely had electricity, and we had this amazing gourmet dinner with this incredible, wait for it, long view out to the surrounding valley and out to Great Salt Lake. It was a really incredible time. And we really drove home this point that perspective, we think, matters. It's part of our job. It's part of what One North tries to bring to the table, is perspective from the outside, perspective across industries, perspective on the entire sort of landscape of sort of problems and chaos that folks are dealing with. And we get the perspective of kind of working with lots of different kinds of clients, so we can bring that different experience to the table when we're engaging with folks. So perspective is the key to our success. Fast forward, 2024, we wanted to swing the pendulum as far the other direction as we possibly could while still providing something that felt a little bit like a retreat. So we came to Palm Springs. There's nothing subtle about this place. If you have spent any time here, and if you haven't been here, hopefully you've seen it already. It is an oasis in the middle of the desert, and it has been kind of a haven for creatives and eclectics for the last 75 years. It's halfway kind of jumping off point between LA and Vegas. So the Rat Pack hung out here back in the day. Celebrities have been kind of making their way through here. Robert Downey Jr. is infamous for this particular location. You can Google it later and find out why. But it is a place that is completely diverse and open and eclectic and kind of fascinating, but it's also completely manufactured. And that's the thing I think is kind of interesting about it. If you turn off the water and the electricity of this place, things probably get really scary around July or August. And when you land in a plane, you can see the lawns just kind of end, right? Everything's being watered and manicured. It's a giant garden. And then you show up at the Parker, and if there's nothing subtle about Palm Springs, the Parker's a splash of cold water and a slap in the face. And that's it. Honestly, it sort of freaked me out a little bit when we first came and looked at it last year. The thought of trying to put on an event and competing with this, with all of this. And then as we kind of sat with it, as Jen and Tanya and I were here for a couple days, we thought about it over breakfast the next day, and we were like, no, this is the perfect place to talk about that extension of that idea of how to deal with chaos and think about it as a creative buffet of opportunity. If you can sort of have that long-term plan sort of built with your team, you can look at chaos, the chaos around you, and be a master of it and be able to pluck what you want from it and push the other things aside and separate the things. And the Parker is an amazing sort of, I think, example of that. So we're really asking you guys to be open over the course of the next day and a half, be open to new ideas, be open to meeting each other, to having weird conversations and fun conversations and awkward conversations that you might not know where they're going. Pick out interesting ideas from the sessions and prompt conversations with people. That's what we're all here for. You guys are all experts in your field. So we're hoping that that magic happens again this year. So we're asking you to be open. The topic, of course, is chaos and control through the looking glass of an ever-changing world. And I'm excited to kind of tease this theme out as we've watched the content come together. There's all these connection points. You're going to see a bunch of things in my talk that hopefully look interesting to you, and they will come back around, hopefully, in other people's talks a little bit later on today. So, and if there's other conversations you want to have, please seek me out later and we can talk through things. But I've already kind of made the case that technology, I think, often contributes, and I think we think often contributes to the daily chaos that we experience. We sort of let it happen to ourselves a lot of times, I think. We sort of reflexively just absorb it. And it's been that way since the beginning. We've been gluttons for technologies. From the moment these things were in our hands, and I'm old enough to remember those bricks, or the ones in bags that were in the car. Do you remember those? We wanted more out of it. We wanted more battery life, more connectivity. We wanted more functionality. And then we started to get really comfortable with the internet and computing. And that, very quickly, we wanted more from that. We got greedy real quick. And then social media showed up. And sort of, we thought, what if we could put all of these things together? And the great gods of the technology of Silicon Valley gave us the smartphone. And the cool thing is, it's been like totally awesome ever since the smartphone kind of came into our lives. Maybe not. I mean, I have kids. I know what the slack-jawed TikTok scroll looks like. I mean, we have invented features for this thing that are just horrendous when you talk about them, but we've used them seriously in conversation. Endless scroll, programmatic advertising. I mean, these tools and techniques that we think about to gain user acceptance and connection are sort of beating us up. And we're starting to feel the full weight of it. So I'm ready for that change that Jen, Lil, and I were talking about this morning. I think there's a bunch of really new, exciting things that we can experience. Let's go back again and look at how our relationship with the internet has evolved over time. So starting with, the basic internet. I got my first email address in college. That tells you how old I am. I started to surf the internet really sort of in late college, mid-college. And at the beginning, it was kind of a mess, if you guys remember. It was message boards. It was hard to get around. You had to use weird search platforms. But then Google came and changed it all for us and served up the web and the world on a silver platter, allowed us to go and see and meet people from all over the world, to start to look at data and track things and understand how users behaved with all of these devices. And we became really, really adept at it. I think we're all search experts in a way that maybe only like librarians were 20 or 30 years ago. We know how to find things and how to ask questions out of this platform to get the most out of it, and it accelerates sort of our productivity, but it also turns us into total monsters. maybe not you guys, but others out there, go look at a message board. It is becoming kind of a pastime and a sport to look at comment boards, message boards, and just go find a place to insert yourself and stir the pot. And then when you combine that idea sort of back with social media and kind of where we started, it gets kind of messy really quick. But let's look at the data. Data is helpful sometimes to think about the context. 59% of people in 2010 accessed the internet wirelessly or through laptops. It's a good amount, surprising amount for 2010, 15, 14 years ago. 11% of cell phone users purchased a product on their phone. Only 20% of cell phone users had used their phone to watch a video at that point. And then you fast forward to today, and 60% of the internet traffic is mobile, which is a big number. I'm actually surprised that it's that low. 45% of global consumers shop daily on their phones, but 50% of the traffic on the internet is estimated to be bots. So that's data that you guys are looking at, trying to make decisions on. That's comments that are being written by bots on message boards. That's content that's being created by AI and by bots. So the data system is flawed. We're going to talk a bunch about this later today. But what we're looking at is not what we think we're looking at. And this user experience suddenly just got a whole lot more complicated and a little overwhelming. And I think that one of the things Jen and I talked about this morning was the difference between sort of my parents' generation or us, how we engage with content and social media versus the way my kids engage with social media and with content. They don't trust hardly anything on the web anymore. That's why TikTok and Snapchat and mindless little content and 30-second videos showing you how to make an omelet cracked over rice, like that is their chosen preferred way of engaging with the world. It's super limited, but it's safe. And so I think I'm going to posit that we have the power to cut through all that noise, and it's built into us already to use that chaos to our advantage, but it's going to take us doing some things a little differently. I think making human connections and human observations can help us locate these threads that can cut through the chaos. And we have more opportunity than ever before because of the proliferation of platforms and the power of technology. If we use the force to our advantage and in smart ways, I think we can leverage some risk, put ourselves out there, and find a way to truly cut through. That was a long way to get to my title slide, but longest title of the entire program, tallest speaker, longest trek to the title slide. So how do we find those threads? I think it's built into our nature to look for and create them. It's who we are as humans. Again, I'm giving the secret away, guys. This is the answer that's going to run through everything today. When we came out and visited the Parker, I thought a lot about this. This phrase, calamity and humanity, kind of kept running through my head. It just felt like this accumulation of furniture and objects and things from our past and our present. Everything was mixed. You kind of couldn't tell what was what. This labyrinth sort of garden as you're kind of walking through with surprises around every corner. And I just kept thinking at the end how comforted I was with all of that. And so this phrase was rattling around in my head, and then all of a sudden I thought about a movie that got released in 2022, written, produced, and directed by a couple of music video producers who had written a couple of small indie films. This movie swept the Oscars that year. This is the height of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The multiverse was on full display. It was actually kind of the beginning of the waning of the Marvel multiverse years. And it was everything everywhere all at once. Who's seen this movie? What I'm about to say is not a ringing endorsement of this movie. I love this movie. I don't think it's for everyone. I would not want my parents to watch this movie and then try to have a conversation about it with them afterwards. I'm not going to recommend it to them. But I think it's fascinating. It is a movie about the human experience at its core, in the midst of all this chaos that's happening throughout the entire thing. It is a movie about mothers and daughters and families and the immigrant experience, what it means to be a success and failure in this life. It's a movie about finding your own way, becoming your own person. I cried several points during this movie. It's also a movie about hot dog fingers. And if you haven't seen the movie, this slide makes absolutely no sense, but it's emblematic of the chaos that is around in this movie the entire time. And that's honestly like the point of this movie. The guys that wrote this movie, the Daniels, two guys named Daniel, Daniel Kwan gave this interview for The Verge, and I love this quote. I'm so happy I found it because it's basically the synopsis of my talk. I think life has always been chaos, but we've never been so close to the chaos. The chaos is literally in our pocket every single day. I hope that this film, in some weird way, as chaotic as it is, will connect with audiences because they recognize this life and themselves in it. Like, the magic is being able to see the story, despite all the distractions of the stuff that's happening around you. And this is what I think my kids wrestle with all the time. It's what endless scroll does to your brain, the dopamine hits of just constant like, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's interesting. It's exhausting. And it's distracting from the things that we really need to do in order to find inspiration to drive us forward. I think that finding those connections that break through requires us to take some risks and engage in the digital world in a more human way than ever before. And it got me thinking about this quote that I'd read from Chuck Palahniuk. Sorry for the two quotes so close together. Get used to it. There's a lot of quotes today. But he says, he's the guy who wrote Fight Club. He's written a bunch of other books too. Our real discoveries come from chaos, from going to the place that looks wrong and stupid and foolish. So got me thinking about a time in my life where I put myself at risk of being wrong and stupid and foolish. I think most of us probably felt wrong and stupid and foolish during this time. It was college. Specifically for me, it was my college improv group. Which is aptly titled Rice Pilaf, don't ask me why. The troupe came with the name, but that is me, the tall one in the top middle, shiny 19-year-old me. That's me with a planter on my head because it's hilarious. But this was like a breakthrough moment, I think, in my life's experience. I was a musical theater kid in high school. I did a bunch of theater, a lot of singing. Got to college, had a hard time finding my people. I wanted attention. And so I found this group, and I made some really intense, strong relationships in this group. We did games-based improv. For those of you who knows a bit about improv, I'm going to talk a lot about improv today. So it was games-based improv. There's two styles of improv. We'll get into that in a minute. This is the height of Whose Line Is It Anyway? The famous TV show. That's games-based improv. And we would do shows for folks on campus. We would travel around. I got to do comedy with Pete Holmes on a tour, if you guys know who Pete Holmes is. That guy, when I graduated college, in the bottom right-hand corner, Aaron Nichols, dragged me to Chicago. We got an apartment together. I thought I was done with improv, and then he dragged me to an audition at the Playground Theater in Chicago, which is a different kind of improv. It's long-form improv. Again, I'll define those in a minute. I did not want to go. I was literally done. But he made me go because he was nervous. He was trying to get into the theater scene in Chicago. Do you guys see where this is going? I got on the team. He did not. It made for an incredibly awkward year of Elise. Me coming home from weekly practices and shows and him trying to find his way into the theater scene. He made it just fine. He runs a theater group in Indiana, so he's doing okay. But the Playground Theater was profound because suddenly I was doing shows for paying audiences. And I was doing a very different kind of improv that was much more risky, and I'll get into that in a minute. But what came of this for me is I built these strong, intensely strong relationships because we were all taking risks together. We were all communally participating in something, folks on stage, and trying to tell a story and communicate an idea, and it created something very, very powerful. So today, I'm going to talk about improvisation through the lens of three different things. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive in improv comedy for those of you who want to know. It's a fascinating story, I promise. Improvisation in music, which is also a really interesting story, and then maybe something that's a little bit more unlikely, improvisation in architecture. This is the obligatory definition slide that you put at the beginning of one of these talks. So improvise, to make, provide, or arrange from whatever materials are readily available. It's a basic kind of definition, but it's what we do every day. It's what we do when we go down and make breakfast in the morning. We look in the fridge and what do I feel like and what do I have, and I'm gonna just improvise a breakfast, right? So it's a very cheap word in that way. But I think when you're improvising in a very specific way to try and get to a real outcome, you get to the root word of the word improvise, which is to improve, to make something better, to make something more than what you had at the beginning. And that's really the idea behind this chaos and control idea, is to improvise our way through the chaos to be able to find the things that can help us cut through and make our way in this world. So let's start talking about improvisation in comedy. It starts with Jane Addams. Who knows who Jane Addams is? She's pretty famous, especially in the city of Chicago. She's I also might owe my marriage to Jane Addams, and I'll get to that in a minute. Jane Addams was a settlement and women's suffrage activist. She was a reformer, a social worker, a sociologist, a public administrator, a philosopher, an author, a queer icon, and just frankly, kind of a total badass. If you don't know about her, I highly encourage you. There's a handful of women in this talk. I would highly encourage you guys to go research. She's incredible. She founded this thing called Hull House on Chicago's South Side. It's basically the template for the community space, for community rooms, for park districts. She basically created that, brought it from Europe and kind of created that here. Hull House was this huge community center that had a barber shop and an employment office and a coffee shop, and it had acting studios and it had painting studios and it had a library. It had all these resources for the community. And Chicago at this time was, the great melting pot of America. It was this influx of immigrants. We needed cheap labor, so folks were coming from Europe. Everyone spoke different languages. It was chaos on the streets. There were very, very rich people, titans of industry, and then there were very, very, very poor people, and there was a giant chasm between them. And Jane Addams' idea was that the things that make us alike are finer than the things that make us different. And so she wanted to create a place that was beautiful enough and had enough to offer to get all of those people to be in the same place at the same time, rubbing shoulders and learning something from each other and becoming a community. Okay, so hold that thought in your head. Let's jump forward to Viola Spolin. Again, another total badass. Please research her. There's a whole website dedicated to her life's history. It's a very quick read. But her first 30 years on this planet were nothing short of really interesting, totally bizarre, and kind of awe-inspiring. But Viola Spolin is kind of the grandmother of improv comedy. She actually did write the book on improv comedy called Improvisation for the Theater. And in it, she outlines a handful of games-based improv theater games that you can use to sort of build community, especially for children, to kind of build relationships. And this is her teaching one of those classes. She approached Jane Addams at Hull House and said, I would love to do this program. I'd love to take the techniques that I've been writing about and bring them to Hull House. I know you have all these kids and all these people that speak all these different languages. Here's the cool thing. They don't need to speak the same language in order to play these games. They just need to know the basic rules. We need to communicate the basic rules of improv. Who knows what the most important rule of improv is? Yes and? Yes and. Yes and is the most important rule of improv. It's so important that they came up with a second rule that is basically the same as the first rule, which is no negotiation. So yes and is my partner in the scene says, hey, we're going to do this thing, and this is the idea for what we're going to talk about while we're on stage. And instead of you saying, yes, but I want to do this other thing too, you say yes and I'm not going to negotiate. I'm going to go all in and do what you want to do, and we're going to tell that story. So that's the foundation of improv. The third rule of improv is that everything affects you. Everything that's happening on stage, everything that's happening in the audience, the way the audience is responding, the lighting, the background, all of that stuff affects you. You have to kind of take all of those conditions in and interpret them and use them in the story. And then the last, you have to physicalize. There's no backdrop. There might be some kind of backdrop, but it has nothing to do with what you're talking about. There's no props. So when you're shooting a gun, when you're answering the phone, when you're putting on a coat, you have to do those things as big as possible to get the idea across to folks on stage that you're communicating and being very, very obvious so that those things are taken for granted and they can focus on the story. I mentioned there's two kinds of improv. So theater games, this is the thing that Viola Spolin created. So contact, gibberish, mirror speech, these were three of her first games. These are all games that can be sort of played without really understanding or having a common language. So contact is I touch you, and because I'm touching you, you can talk. And then when I remove my hand, you have to stop talking. That in itself is just kind of a funny thing if you can do some back and forth with it. Gibberish is literally making up a language on the spot. So taking language off the table and just trying to communicate through actions and through your body. Mirror speech is just repeating and parroting what the other person has said and then adding something onto it. So it's a great way to learn languages when you're trying to teach languages across. So again, building connections, building these bridges. But there's dozens and dozens of other games that have been created over the years. Long-form improv is a little different. This is a little scarier. 30 to 60 minutes plus, sometimes it's an hour and a half. It involves this idea called the herald. The herald is essentially, you get a suggestion from the audience. Can I have an occupation? Can I have a this? You take that suggestion and then you build a primary establishing scene on the spot. You follow that by a series of smaller scenes that break down or kind of explain how you got to that establishing scene. And then you bring it all back together at the end. You're calling your own scenes. You're literally on stage performing, yelling scene, and then you run off stage. 2 other people jump into the scene and they continue a new scene on stage. When it works, it is magical. You see intense human emotions. It's the experience that I have watching Everything Everywhere All at Once. But you see these intense human interactions, these great stories, these hilarious things that take place that are totally authentic and totally in the moment. Nothing is prepared ahead of time, and it feels like it is. When it's done well, when it's done poorly, it sucks. It is the worst. And my team at the playground sucked at the very beginning. We were so bad. People would leave in the middle. It was a free show, and people would leave in the middle of it. There were shows after us, and they would leave before those. But by the end of the year, after working together for a year, we had some magical moments, some really intense magical moments. So let's go back to Viola Spolin and sort of the legacy of improv. Viola Spolin's son was a guy named Paul Schulz. It's his stage name. Viola Spolin did not take her husband's name. Paul Schulz founded the Second City with a couple of other people. He's sort of the original idea of the Second City. And if you guys don't know anything about the Second City, hopefully you recognize some of these faces, at least in their young form. This is just a small sampling of the people that have made their way through the Second City that are the bedrocks of not just comedy in the world, but entertainment, of arts and leisure in general, of sometimes writing, like fine academic writing. I mean, like there's some incredible talent up here. Some folks that left the Second City went on to found the Playground. And so this is that through line from Jane Addams and Viola Spolin all the way through to the Playground. Were it not for Viola Spolin and Jane Addams having that conversation, were it not for the Settlement House, Hull House, I would not have made my way to the Playground. I probably should thank Aaron Nichols also, but it's more dramatic if I connect it to Jane Addams. I'll write him a note. But I got on that team, and there was one other woman on that team that I developed a strong connection with who's been my wife for the last 21 years. I would not have met her. We would not have our family were it not for that very awkward year of having very difficult shows that eventually resulted in magic. So what can we take away from improvisation and comedy? Again, I want you guys to think about these ideas abstractly. I'm talking about comedy, but I think hopefully you'll be able to take these takeaways and apply them to your world, and I'll try to make some of those connections. So first, yes, and of course. I think this is every day, being open to new ideas, being quick to listen and slow to speak and understand what folks are bringing to you, what their problems are that they're bringing to you, the challenge that's being presented. The second is that the scene happens between people. I think as leaders, we sometimes forget that it's not about us just standing up here talking. This is not improv. Improv takes place between people having a human connection and trying to develop a real story. The second thing, or third thing is imagine the unseen. I think there's the context that's happening outside of your office or your boardroom or your pitch room that you constantly have to keep in the back of your mind. And you have to bring those things to the forefront when you're making decisions and trying to make people feel safe in an area where you're going to improvise. Fourthly, the conflict creates tension, and tension can be good. I think this is something that having difficult conversations is hard. Making your way through those difficult conversations in the world, the real world, is necessary to actually get to the better outcome on the other side. And that tension can create strong bonds of relationship on the other side of it. And then very, very lastly, all of these kind of culminate in great things come from trust and vulnerability. Again, those relationships, there's people on both those teams that I was on that I still have lunch with on a regular basis. I travel to see incredible, incredible people. So let's talk about improvisation and music. I think a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about improvisation and music. Who's a musician in this, an accomplished musician in this? Okay. So you guys know what this is. This is the bass clef, the treble clef. This is the most amazing thing about music is this is the basic foundation for all music. This is the framework that every single song that's ever been written in the history of the world sits on. It doesn't matter if it's a single drum or if it's an entire orchestra. This is the starting point. And when you start adding elements to it, things can get really complicated. It's a dad joke, guys. But no, seriously, things can get really complicated. This is arguably, if you search for it on the internet, this is what the internet says is the most complicated piece of music ever written. It's also totally unlistenable. So write down the title, go listen to it if you want to laugh, but Fairies, Air, and Death Waltz, this is an attempt to push that framework to its extreme and see if you could break it. And I think he broke it. But let's go back to the beginning of kind of improvisation in music. It really starts in kind of the Middle Ages, a long stretch of time, I know, but these medieval sort of pipers and groups, and minstrel music that sort of came out of the medieval ages, they started to improvise cadenzas. They would step out and do a little solo, sort of in the middle of a traditional song. So take something that was familiar, improvise a new verse, and then go back to kind of the traditional and blow everyone's mind in the audience because it was something that was new that they hadn't heard before. But improvisation really wasn't the thing that they were trying to do. They were just trying to surprise and delight and entertain. Fast forward to the 1800s and enter Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt is sort of the Justin Bieber of his day. He was sort of looked down upon by all the serious musicians. He was a bit of a playboy. He was independently wealthy. He was also like a child prodigy. He was just annoying in a lot of different ways. But he wrote really beautiful music, and he made this parlor trick out of improvising entire songs out of thin air. So he would establish sort of something in a chord structure and then improvise for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and the pieces were remarkable. I'm going to show you what that sounds like in a minute here, but it's important to note that improvisation music is actually pretty simple. All you need to be able to do is understand music theory, be proficient with building, producing chords, chord progressions, melody, create intervals and sequences in your head in real time, use melodies within a scale, play arpeggios, understand the variation of tones available within those structures, all while sounding very natural and appealing and something that somebody wants to listen to. And it looks something like this, or sounds something like this. This is actually a theme that Liszt created. So he improvised on this theme. He wrote down the theme, but he did not obviously record the rest of the song. So this person is interpreting in the style of Liszt a theme that was produced. So let's just listen to it for a minute. I'm going to tell you what's happening at the beginning, and then I'll shut up and let you listen to it. So he's setting the mood, kind of identifying the chord structure that he's going to start with, and then resolving a little bit of that chord progression. Now he's going to build the landscape of the song where it's going to sit. It's not a mistake. He's creating atonal tension. And then he's resolving that tension. It's a little like a dance, sort of pushing the audience a little away and then pulling the audience back in. So this goes on for 20 minutes. I listened to this again last night before I went to bed. It's fascinating because it becomes several different songs over the course of the piece, but it's a completely orchestrated, collected work that he's creating in his mind. These are not written beforehand. There's no shorthand. There's no little bit that he's pulling in that he had done before. There's a few tiny little recognizable moments where you're like, oh, I've heard that before. But it builds and swells and then disappears. It pushes you away, it pulls you back in. It creates this whole emotional landscape, all sort of happening in the moment. But the place where improvisation music gets really interesting and I think exciting is when you look at jazz. And if you've seen the famous jazz documentary by Ken Burns, you'll know how important jazz was to the explosion of music in America. The impact of jazz and blues is incalculable on popular music and honestly the diversity of music that we've experienced over the course of our lifetimes. Rapid advancements in like recording technology and being able to like mass produce music and send it out over radio like helped certainly to expose people to new kinds of music, and advancements in technology and transportation certainly helped. But jazz as an art form is really rooted in this idea of experimentation and finding something new. So this is Sarah Vaughan. If you don't know who Sarah Vaughan is, she's an incredible jazz vocalist who do these improvisations, improvising lyrics, improvising sounds, improvising melodies. Absolutely incredible. This is obviously Charlie Parker. If you know Charlie Parker, I think to like most people who just experience Charlie Parker casually, it sounds like a lot of blips and plops and bloops and bleeps. And they're not quite sure what's happening, but you have to understand that what's happening in his head is 20 years of experience playing the saxophone and bringing that structure to the stage and then trying something that is new. And he's working out basically a math problem in his head in real time. Keith Jarrett, another very, very famous jazz pianist, improvised lots of his own music, similar and very dissimilar to Franz Liszt. And then Big Daddy Kane. I mean, like the extension, when you draw the through line of sort of what it means to improvise as a performer, you can draw connection points starting with Sarah Vaughan kind of all the way through to Big Daddy Kane. I stumbled across this data visualization set. I could not for the life of me figure out what school these kids were at that did this. They were definitely in college. They leveraged the Columbia University's Labrosa's Million Song data set. You can click on the link when you get your hands on the deck and tell me if you can find out what school they were at. But they looked at the genre and how different styles of music progressed over the course of the last 60 years, 50 years. And what they found was this explosion starting kind of in the jazz era and when records started to become readily available sort of around the world. And this explosion of creativity and genre escalation across time periods. They also created this incredible interactive graphic that has a slider underneath it. This is built out to 2020. But if you slide it all the way back to the 50, there's far fewer connections, and it's basically illustrating all the connections and influences across those songs and themes and tone and lyrics across those different styles of music, showing the connections. And I think what you have here at the end when it's built out at its final stage is like the beautiful landscape that is contemporary music. When I listen to music with my kids, I don't hear rock and pop and rap the way that I did when I was their age. I hear little bits and pieces of all those things kind of happening in all those songs. So we're starting to create a different kind of songbook. And I think I would argue that it all sort of starts with this experimentation and improvisation in jazz. I was listening to an interview with Eric Clapton the other day. It just popped up in my feed. I'm not a huge Eric Clapton fan, but he was talking about the first time he got to hear Stevie Ray Vaughan. If you guys know who Stevie Ray Vaughan is. And he said the thing that was amazing about Stevie Ray Vaughan is, and this is Eric Clapton talking, he's like, I step out to do a solo and I'm thinking, what am I going to do next? And there's a moment when you listen to Eric Clapton, you can see it. He sort of pauses and then he blisters into a rip, and then he pauses and then he blisters into a rip. He's thinking about what he's going to do next. And it's incredible. But he said the thing that was amazing about Stevie Ray Vaughan was that he was a fountain of that improvisation and creativity. There was no pausing. It was just flowing through him. All those years of practice, all those years of kind of working it out with other musicians in the space resulted in this virtuosity that allowed him to do whatever he wanted to do. You think about jam bands. This is for you, Steve. You think about jam bands, Fish, Grateful Dead. What's the spaghetti one? String cheese incident. They are in that same league, in that same category of just sort of in the moment, just driving these extensive, and it's not everyone's flavor. I totally get that, but it does sort of push new ideas out there in really incredible ways. So let's talk about some key takeaways that we can learn from improvisation music. One is that improvisation, I think, often leads to incredible innovation. In and of itself, it is incredible innovation. But without a foundation, improvisation can just create chaos. I played the saxophone for a couple years in grade school. I was terrible at it. My sister played the clarinet. She was also terrible at it. If we had attempted to improvise without 20 years of experience, it would have sounded incredibly poor. So it is just chaos if you don't have that foundation. I think the other really important thing is it takes practice to be spontaneous. It's the same thing in comedy. Without 6 months of practice, we don't get to that magical moment we're actually telling a story on stage, even though we're making it up. Again, you guys have years and years of practice in all of your respective fields doing your thing. Remembering that you have that to lean on and bring that to the table and be present enough to understand how it's going to impact the conversations you're having or the problems you're trying to solve is really, really important. Playing with others allows improvisers to take bigger risks. When you have folks that are in on it with you, supporting you in that moment, it gives you the confidence to step out and take a risk and make a mistake and keep going and learn from it and push forward. And lastly, and this is, I think, most importantly, taking risk blurs boundaries in genre and style, which leads to an explosion of quality and diversity. And I think that diversity thing, we'll talk about that throughout the day and tomorrow as well, is probably one of the best things that can come from improvisation. It levels the playing field when you have developed the right kind of environment to allow for improvisation to take place. It levels the playing field when it comes to voices and creates a safe physical space for people to share ideas. So let's talk about the least likely sort of topic, I think, for improvisation in architecture. I don't think this is not something you would normally think of as being something that's improvisable. The traditional definition of improvisation in architecture kind of sucks. This is not the definition that I want to use. It's really like interior design base. When you look at it, it's rearranging pillows. It's taking manufacturing space and turning it into living space or office space, repurposing of spaces. That's the traditional definition of improvisation in architecture, but that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about two giants in their fields, their respective fields, so Zaha Hadid and Frank Gehry. I think a lot of people are familiar with Frank Gehry. Maybe a few people are, less people are familiar with Zaha Hadid, but she was incredible. She's passed. Zaha Hadid was an incredible visual artist as well as an incredible architect. So she filled countless notebooks with these really gestural kind of boxes and sketches that were more feeling than thinking. And she talked about it as kind of being in a meditative state when she was doing it. She didn't really even know what she was scribbling down. So you can find pages of these, photographs of pages of these on the internet. And they're little tiny, just quick sketches, just over and over and over again. She was incredibly prolific. And if you know her work, or if you've seen her work, you can see how those sketches directly kind of connect to this space. She's intuitively relying on, 20, 30 years of engineering experience in building buildings and learning from all of her different mistakes and intuitively knowing what it takes to actually make a space livable, usable, buildable, all those things. But then pushing it beyond that, a lot of those drawings end up in the garbage. A lot of those drawings just end up on the shelf. Some of those drawings end up on a gallery wall. And then some of those drawings inform some of the most insane architecture I think I've ever seen. These don't look real. These look AI generated. And I don't think you get to this place without all of that other stuff. You don't sit down with a floor plan and end up here. You only get there by being messy and making a ton of mistakes. Frank Gehry does something very similar, but also very different. And I think there's a different lesson that we can learn from Frank Gehry. So this is the famous Guggenheim in Bilbao. It's one of the things that first got him worldwide acclaim. He has an amazing amphitheater in Chicago in Millennium Park that we're lucky to have. But he starts with these sketches also. He also starts with a use case, which I think is a different place than Zaha Hadid starts with often. He starts with, he knows it's going to be a museum, and he knows kind of where it's going to be, and he kind of knows what the site's going to be. And then he starts sketching. I saw an article, or I read an interview with him where he was talking about the museum he built in France 20 years ago or so. And he started sketching fish. He didn't know why, but he started sketching little goldfish. And he sketched them over and over again, and they started to abstract, and he was fascinated with the scales. You can even see it in this building, the scales on the side of the building. In all of his buildings, you can kind of see it. But he was fascinated with the scales and the shape of the fish. And he created this museum that basically was inspired from a drawing of a fish. But the thing that makes Frank Gehry special is the fact that he relies on, again, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of engineering experience of building buildings over and over again, being an expert in his field. And I found this incredible article that talked about him as possibly being one of the world's best UXers, because he thinks about the different use case scenarios, almost like a design system that you would use to build a website. And he thinks about the different use case scenarios within that building. So the entryway, the performing space, the educational spaces, the bathrooms, the kitchen area, what the gardens or the verandas, and all the places that needed to be in this building. And then he designs them all out separately as individual components. So that's them all hung on the wall. And then this is them all put together in kind of the final maquette, final model for the museum. And I think that kind of thinking, that thinking about users first, is a really interesting way to connect when you connect that with improvisation, because he's able to innovate at the micro level and then also to innovate at the macro level in the moment. Last section is always the shortest. Isn't that great? We're wrapping up. So key takeaways from improvisation in architecture. Eventually, the outcome actually really matters in architecture. And I think for us in our worlds, the outcome really does matter. We're being paid to do our jobs. We can't just improvise forever and throw all the work away. So we have to think about where we're going. Users, use case, site, location, those things are important. Sometimes on the flip side, a sketch is just a sketch. And that sketch will lead to another sketch that will lead to an incredible breakthrough. And relying on that fact, knowing that we are experts and that improvisation is part of the process, is part of the game of learning how to leverage improvisation. Thirdly, architecture is always in service of and in reaction to something else in the world. I think it's something that most people don't think about when they're entering and leaving buildings, but when you go into any kind of a city center, the building that you're in, if an architect's thinking about the building, is in communication with the place, the city, what's across the street, what's down the street. If there's a notable historical building, most often architects are referencing that other building, and there's a conversation happening that's outside of the specific job that you're doing in that building. Even in this place, these are reused buildings on this property. The original Holiday Inn is kind of the main hotel here. We have obviously different homes that have been repurposed, but this is a manufactured space that is in response. This view is blowing my mind, looking at you guys for sure. But just take a minute and look at how they've kind of framed out this back view to the outside. So it's taking the outside, it's referencing this outside manufactured sort of space, this garden, and making it part of the inside. So there's always a conversation in a building between what's happening outside, what's happening in that location, and what's happening inside the building. I think this is probably the most important one of the four up here, is that the creative process is meant to be stretched and pushed. That's what it's designed to do. It is not meant to be put in a box into a 60-minute meeting and said, we're going to be creative here, and then we're going to move on. We're going to have a brainstorming session, and then we're going to forget about it and take the best 3 ideas, and then we're going to keep going. It's meant to be pulled into every little conversation. It's meant to take a moment and push something a little bit further. It's meant to say, time out. We're hitting a dead end in this conversation. We need to do something differently. Let's take a quick break and come back, and let's think about it a little bit differently. The creative process is meant to be pushed into the conversation. So bringing it all back together, what does it take to improvise? I started with this quote, but this was quote just to start the talk. This is actually the wrong quote to end the talk. I think this is the right quote to end the talk. This is from Kelly Leonard, the Executive Director of Insights and Applied Improvisation at the Second City. He says, improvisation is an expression of what it means to be human. Building those relationships, taking those risks, putting yourself out there, being your best version of yourself in that exact moment is the way that we see the world creatively, and we can cut through the chaos that's happening around us and pick and choose things that tell an actual story. And I think ultimately the most important part is that we learn from our dead ends by finding a new way, hopefully together. Quick sort of obligatory logo slide inserted in the talk. These are some of the most innovative businesses on the planet. They've redefined industries, they've redefined themselves, sometimes in short periods of time, sometimes over the course of a century or two. Regardless of whether the impact is good or bad, the fact that these businesses are so incredibly powerful and have had such an impact and have been able to reinvent themselves time and time again doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. It happens because people are given the freedom and take the risk to be able to push new ideas out into the story and into the conversation and find a new way together. So what can we learn? Quick list of takeaways. To be a great improviser, you need to establish some rules. Rules are really important because it means you're all on the same page and you're all kind of acting in the same way when you're improvising. Secondly, good improvisation allows us to find new territory quickly. Injecting it into a place where you feel stuck is the way that you find a new path that you didn't see before. Improvising can lead to incredible connection with your audience or team. If you're doing it right and folks feel safe and they feel safe enough to make mistakes, you will have better relationships and better connections coming out of that room. I think ultimately it makes us better communicators because it forces you to be specific about what you're trying to say. And it forces you in the moment to express or say something that you don't know how to say or you don't know what it is. I know that it's done that for me. And so I'm super thankful for my history in improvisation. But when I'm leading, when I'm running a meeting, it is something that we really try to focus on. What did you mean by that? Let's clarify that. Let's take another pass at that. Give somebody room to re-explain themselves. It creates the opportunity for psychological safety. We're going to talk a bit about this throughout the day. You're going to hear this drum beat. It's almost going to be a drinking game. So not for the talk, but later, just check those things down and then we'll have shots maybe at the party. And then lastly, improvisation can reinforce and build community within your teams and organizations. And this is the most important part because it has more to do with listening than it does with actually creating or communicating. It's about observing. It is about being a good listener. It's about knowing what's happening in the environment and then being smart enough to know the right moment to actually say the thing that you want to say instead of just filling the space. I think if we become experts at finding these threads and taking risks, those threads ultimately become our safety net and allow it to be the safety net for our teams and find a new way together. Real quick, I want to talk about making connections, bringing some of those connections to the assembly. Bill talked a little bit about it, so I'm going to double down on one thing he said, which is please be present. We put a ton of effort into all the talks. I know that the team has put months and months of effort into the talks and trying to make them entertaining and exciting and interesting. But you guys have also sacrificed a bunch to be here. You've had conversations with your leaders at your organization, explain how you're going to use the budget to come here, all that kind of stuff. Let's make it worth it. Just lean in. It's a day and a half. It's going to be incredible. Look for sparks and big ideas. I see people writing stuff down. Keep doing that. But look for the things that really resonate. Make sure you circle those. And then try to identify blockers, but don't dwell on them. There are going to be moments where you're like, oh, I could never do that at my play. I could never bring that back home. Try to ignore those things for now. Find a way to push some of those ideas into your space or into your work. And then this is probably one of the most important ones. Maybe the last one's the most important one. But share ideas with people you don't know. You guys are all kind of hand-selected to be here. We painstakingly kind of built the list of invites, the folks that we wanted to be here because this is a conversation. And if you guys are talking and sharing ideas and having conversations about the things that we're talking about, then we're winning. Then this is actually breaking the mold of what conferences are meant to do. And then the very last thing that's most important is yes and. That's all I have for you guys. Enjoy your trip.
Are we on?
Yeah.
We are. Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. We're running a little ahead of schedule, so questions, comments? Anybody have anything for Ryan? I've got one. Okay. Stacy?
Yes, please.
I already blew it.
It's like a Phil Donahue moment.
Yeah.
First, congratulations on your promotion.
Thank you. Thank you, Stacy.
Talk a little bit about how you improv at One North.
It's a good question. I think one of the things that I've tried to do, I mean, you can ask the team, the managing director team with me, is I try to bring less structure to meetings than I think I need. We had a meeting yesterday that I thought resulted in some really intense, great conversation. And I think we got to the heart of some issues that we wanted to work through that we wouldn't have gotten to if I just prepared an agenda. I think when I think to our most effective meetings as a team and the place where I feel like, oh, that was really hard, but also we ended up in a really good spot. I started with a Post-it note of 2 things I wanted to talk about. And we drive through the meeting. And then conversely, when I don't have anything to talk about, I cancel or shorten the meeting. And I show up and I say, hey, what do you guys want to talk about? We don't have anything, we can leave. I think that's probably like the crispest, clearest way that we use improvisation. I think if you ask Jessica that question, and she'll talk a little bit about creativity later, like how her team improvises sort of in the design process, or if you ask Kalev or Zach or Kevin how they think conceptually, or if you ask Pete about how he sort of creatively problem solves, I think they all have their own individualized little ways of doing it. But for me, I think it's really about trying to lean into the fact that our managing director team leads this place together, and it's not any one person. Yeah.
So my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather were all architects.
Yeah.
And they told me I could be anything I wanted, and I grew up studying architecture. The reason was because of what you shared today. They were artists, they were doing beautiful work, and they said, my father said, the hardest part of this is the client.
Yeah.
Because the client comes in with their random preferences and screws up your brilliance. So how do you guys deal with your damn clients?
Hold on, Ryan. I think Nancy, I love that. I do love that. And we've known Nancy for 20 plus years, so we could appreciate that. I'm going to ask you not to answer that.
Oh.
For the safety of all of our jobs. But also, I think Jessica's going to talk about creativity and constraints later, which I think is actually Nancy going to be really point on. So,
Bill,
I'm going to put a pin in that one.
I was going to say the same thing, man.
I was getting nervous.
I made a step on my foot. What did you think I was going to say?
Anyone else? I'm going to put a question out to the crowd. The yes and piece, and Ryan was talking about, we had a leadership meeting yesterday. A lot of us have worked together for many years. I am still a victim myself, and I wonder if you could all self-examine or talk about how you, if anyone like Stacy, instead of asking the question, wants to contribute with how they do it with their teams. I find myself still reflexively becoming defensive. If there is something, I do. I have self-realization here. Of course, I have to attend a talk for me to self-realize this. I'm always thinking about why that won't work as someone is saying it versus why it will work or how I can help make it work. That is a hard blocker on self-realization to get over, but if you can promote the safety piece amongst the crowd in the room, you can do that. So I don't know if anyone else has tried, and yes and is not a new
idea.
Yeah, it's not a new idea, but it's brilliant in a boardroom and a small meeting room and a creativity space. So I'm curious if anybody wants to offer from their teams, their businesses, how they promote that at all. Cindy?
Come on, do your job.
Thanks. We have someone at Allegis IS that always says it's an and, not an or. It's kind of like the yes and, right? And a lot of people are like, well, I only have capacity or budget to do this or that, right? And this one person we work with always says, but it's an and, so how can you do both, right? And then we have to all creatively think about how we're going to, change the capacity to do part of it or offer that and, that yes and. So it's just a concept that's really big right now in our company.
That's
That's
awesome.
great. Perfect. All right.
Anyone else?
Cool.
I know the face that Bill makes when he starts to put his guardrails up, and it looks just like this. So you guys know when he's talking to you, and he starts. It's a new idea. He's uncomfortable. He goes, "Hey, That's exactly what you do.
Son of a. I've been solved. We're not playing poker together later, are we? All right, everybody. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.